We're going to move to the next session now, which is a research-focused session. And we've got two papers that are both looking at FRS data and the Scottish Child Payment. And we're going to first of all hear from Hannah Randolph. So she's talking observing receipt of the Scottish Child Payment in the Family Resources Survey. And Dr. Hannah Randolph is from the University of Strathclyde. And she's a fellow at the Fraser of Allender Institute, and her research uses applied microeconomics and microstimulation modelling to understand UK and Scottish policy challenges related to poverty, inequality, household incomes, the labour market and immigration. So Hannah, would you like to come up?
Thank you, and thanks to the organizers for having me today. So as Jen said, I'll be talking about how we can observe Scottish Child Payment in the Family Resources Survey, and specifically how it's currently imputed. And this is work that was funded by the Aberdeen Financial Fairness Trust. So the context for this is that Scotland has child poverty targets. So these were set in 2017. They're interim targets, which were due in the last year of survey data available, so 2023-24. And then the final targets are due in 2030-31. And so this is one of the measures that the targets are set for, relative poverty. And you can see that since the targets were set in 2017, there's been very limited progress made towards those targets. So we know now that we've missed the interim targets and we're quite a ways off the final targets. But one of the measures that has been introduced to try to reduce child poverty in Scotland is the Scottish Child Payment. And so over the last few years, people have been waiting and waiting to see in the survey data and in the official statistics, which come from the FRS and HBAI, the impact of the Scottish Child Payment. And there's been some kind of increasing concern that we don't see an overall impact in the statistics. And so to give a bit of context on the Scottish Child Payment, so this was introduced in 2021. It's a top-up benefit that's administered by Social Security Scotland. And so it's given to children in households that receive other qualifying benefits, so primarily universal credit. And when it was first introduced, it was for children under the age of 6, and it was £10 per week per child. And then by November 2022, had been expanded to all children under 16 in households receiving qualifying benefits, and it was £25 per week per child. So that's been uprated now to about £27, £28. So not insignificant. And then in the Family Resources Survey, Scottish Child Payment receipt was first kind of suspected to be underreported, which is not uncommon for benefits, in 2021-22. So the following year it was imputed, but it was noted that there were some issues with the imputation, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And so in the most recent year of survey data, they've updated the imputation methodology. And so there was concern among stakeholders in Scotland that we kind of wanted to have an understanding that the new imputation methodology was appropriate, and there was a lot of curiosity around if we'd sort of fixed the method earlier, would that have changed our understanding of trends in child poverty? Because, again, people are really curious, why are we not seeing a decrease in the overall child poverty statistics after the introduction of Scottish Child Payment? So there's a few reasons that this could be. So one is that Scottish Child Payment is either not well targeted or it's too low. But we have pretty good, especially qualitative evidence from speaking to people who are receiving it, that it is making a difference to them. Second reason is that it could be mismeasured, so that's kind of what we're looking at here. And then a third reason could be that Scottish Child Payment is offsetting what would have been a counterfactual rise in child poverty over this period. And so in this paper, we were looking at, is this updated methodology that DWP are going to use for imputing Scottish Child Payment in the FRS appropriate? So just a sense check, does it make sense to us? And then if that methodology had been applied the year prior, would that have changed our understanding of what's going on with child poverty? And so in the 2022-23 Family Resources Survey, Scottish Child Payment was imputed, But there are not a lot of details available publicly about how that was carried out. But I think it was the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, some researchers there sort of pointed out some of the issues in this last year. And so the FRS reports the weekly amount of Scottish Child payment that's received by benefit units. And so if you divide by the amount of the payment at that time, you can get a sense of how many children in the benefit unit were imputed to receive that, and sort of get a sense of who was assumed to be eligible. So a few things kind of jump out if you look at the data. So there's a few cases where it seems like children over the age of 16 who have never been eligible must be receiving the payment, or children between 6 and 15 receiving the payment before it was actually extended to that age group. There's a few cases where it seems like households are probably imputed to receive less than their entitlement, and that's usually when there's a child under the age of 1, so an infant. So there may have been some assumption made about when people are claiming, but that's not really clear. And then it seemed like the amount per week per child was raised from 20 pounds to 25 pounds a month before that actually happened. And then if you kind of gross up the implied number of children, benefit units receiving it, and the implied cost, then those amounts are lower than what you would expect given Social Security Scotland statistics. I've got a little asterisk there because we understand that that's not really what the weights are intended for. This is not the primary use of the survey, but we were looking around for what's some kind of metric we can use to see is the new imputation doing a bit better, and we thought that if we can get a bit closer to these numbers, maybe that's some indication. And so, to be clear, this is not a process that we came up with, so this is Scottish Government and DWP working together have worked out this imputation method, and they were kind enough to share it with us so that we could apply it to the previous year's survey data. So the steps that they use are to identify households with children under 6 that are receiving qualifying benefits, and then randomly choose those qualifying households to receive Scottish Child payment until a take-up rate is met for under 6s. And so that is a metric that's published by Social Security Scotland. You also assume that any older children who are eligible in those chosen households are going to be receiving the payment. Then you carry out a similar procedure for older children, keeping in mind that any household or benefit unit that's already been imputed to receive the payment we're assuming the older kids are getting it too. So when we applied this to 2022-23, we had to deal with a few issues that weren't present in the following year. So one is that older children were only eligible for Scottish Child payment after November 2022, so about halfway through the survey period. And so we only look at, it's only households that are interviewed after that where we consider those children eligible. However, those households were eligible for bridging payments leading up to full expansion. And so that was available to households that were receiving free school meals. That's also available in the FRS, and so we assume that the benefit units that are receiving free school meals qualified for this bridging payment at the maximum amount per child. So we do follow a similar procedure to what was used for the following survey year to match take-up of Scottish Child payment by age group. So take-up is actually quite high for Scottish Child payment. It's about 95% for under 6s in this year, and 77% for kids 6 to 15. And then as a final step, we take away the previously imputed Scottish Child payment income in the FRS and HBAI, add the newly imputed income, and work out household incomes and poverty rates. Because there is a random element of this, of choosing the different households, we run this a bunch of times to make sure that that's not driving our results and average over the different runs. And so we look at a bunch of different measures of child poverty, but there are a few that are particularly important, and specifically those that are part of the child poverty targets. So one is that relative poverty measure at where the poverty line is set at 60% of UK median household income after housing costs. And so this measure, when we apply the new methodology, doesn't actually change at all. So that was somewhat reassuring to see. The measure of material deprivation would have been a little bit different, a little bit lower. And similarly, the measure of absolute poverty that's in the poverty targets would have been a little bit lower. But we don't see any big jumps, so that's a reassuring finding from the paper. We do have a look at the implied caseload and cost just to see, is this kind of in the right ballpark? And it does seem to be about, roughly appropriate. There are some questions about Social Security Scotland publishes their caseload at the end of each quarter. And so June, September, December, March, but because there was a big expansion in November of 2022, it can be a little bit difficult to work out what you think the caseload should be over the full period of that year. But we are somewhere in the right realm. And so the takeaways for us, first of all, were that we think the imputation method is appropriate, the updated methodology, and that it does seem to be more accurately capturing Scottish Child Payment recipients, but it wouldn't really have changed our understanding of child poverty in Scotland in 2022-23, even if it were updated earlier. And so part of this is the very small number of households that are affected. So in any given run of this, there's like maximum 4 households that are switching their poverty status. So it's a very small number of households in the survey that are affected. And in terms of understanding what impact Scottish Child Payment has had, and I think Suzanna is going to say a bit more about this in her presentation, this helps us to rule out mismeasurement as a reason why we haven't seen a big drop in child poverty statistics after the introduction of Scottish Child Payment. And so it seems more likely that it's that third reason that I discussed, that there would have been a rise in child poverty for other reasons over this period that Scottish Child Payment is helping to offset. And that's supported by some microsimulation modeling that's done by Scottish Government and Joseph Rowntree Foundation, saying that without Scottish Child Payment, we would expect child poverty rates to be 3 or 4 percentage points higher. And finally, to say a bit about data improvements, so we're very excited to hear that the FRS will be linking administrative data, and that will really improve our knowledge of who's receiving benefits and how much they're receiving. And then we're just, I'm here to make a plug for, we would really love if devolved benefits can be included in this and are in the development plans as well, because I know that will require communication with devolved benefits administrations. So. And that's me, but I don't think we're taking questions just now, but if you'd like to have a look at the paper, you can follow the link. Thank you.
Okay, so we're now going to move on to our second paper from Suzanna Nesom from University of York. So Susanna's a research associate at the University of York working on the Family Finances Project. She received her PhD from Cardiff University, where she studied gender inequality in the labour market with a particular focus on the devolved nations. And her presentation is exploring the impact of the Scottish Child Payment on poverty.
Okay, great. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Hannah, for your presentation. This presentation builds pretty much directly on what Hannah was saying, and we've been exploring the impact of the Scottish Child Payment on child poverty, amongst other measures as well. So, this is part of the Family Finances Research Project, which is a collaborative project with academics from the University of York and LSE, with colleagues from the Child Poverty Action Group. And the project is utilising the growing divergence in social security provision between Scotland and the rest of the UK to investigate the difference that cash support can make for children. In this project, we're examining the impact of the Scottish Child Payment on child poverty alongside other measures, including emotional well-being of parents, as well as labour market outcomes, but this presentation focuses on child poverty. And alongside this quantitative approach that I'm going to present, we also have a qualitative side to the project as well, where they've interviewed 40 Scottish Child Payment recipients who are obviously in Scotland, as well as 20 comparative parents in Northern England as well. So for this project, we're obviously using the Family Resources Survey, and we use the time period between 2009 and 2024. For obvious reasons, we exclude 2020 data as well. When we do the difference in differences analysis, we have a shorter time frame from 2016 to 2024, and we define the post-Scottish Child Payment period as the last two survey years, but as Hannah has said, there was a staggered rollout of this policy, and it doesn't line up quite as nicely, but it's something that we're thinking through. For our outcomes, for this presentation, we're using income-based poverty measures as well as a broader measure of poverty, including child material deprivation as well as food insecurity. Our treatment group is all children in Scotland, and our control group are children in England. This means that when we estimate our difference in differences specification, then we are, in effect, estimating the effect of living in Scotland on child poverty. And also, in our estimation, we control for a number of characteristics. This is just to ensure that the assumptions hold for our methodology as well, and they're listed here. Okay, so these figures are very much similar to what Hannah presented, and they present our descriptive analysis of child poverty after housing costs over time between Scotland and the rest of the UK. So on the graph on the left-hand side, this shows all children and looks at the child poverty rate. And our analysis shows that we can't conclusively, or there's not yet any conclusive evidence on the overall effect of the Scottish Child Payment on child poverty. That's not to say that some commentators have said that when we looked at pooled data from 2021 to 2024, they suggest that there is a modest decline with, and this could partially be attributed to the Scottish Child Payment, or the introduction of the Scottish Child Payment. The graph on the right-hand side is obviously a little bit different. So this shows the same figures, but this time by family size. So the solid lines are for children that live in larger families. So those who have who are in families with 3 or more children. So they would be subject to the 2-child limit from a number of other benefits, but not for the Scottish Child Payment. And then the dotted lines are for children in smaller families, so for children from families with 1 or 2 children. And you can see that if we take the blue dotted line, so the lowest line on the right-hand side, there has been a decline in the child poverty rate for the recent year. However, when you look at the child poverty rate for children in larger families in Scotland, there's been this significant increase even after the introduction of the Scottish Child Payment. This is quite a surprising find, very unexpected. Originally we thought that we would find that, okay, there might have been an increase in child poverty for children in larger families up in Scotland, but maybe it wouldn't have been as large of an increase as the rest of the UK. So we want to explore that a little bit further. We currently don't really know why this is the case. There was a suggestion that it might be due to housing costs, but as the figures figures are after housing costs, but it might also be that larger families are in deeper poverty. So even with this additional payment, they're not going over the poverty line there. Okay, so I'm going to run through this relatively quickly. Don't want to bore you with econometrics. So basically, we run a simple difference in differences specification where we regress our child poverty measure against an indicator for whether a child lives in Scotland and whether it's post-Scottish child payment introduction, as well as their interaction. We're most interested in the coefficient on the interaction term, and this gives us basically the effect of living in Scotland. It's nowhere near an intention to treat effect at this point. That's something that we'll be looking at a little bit further down the line. We also control for the characteristics that were there at the beginning. And then the table is just showing the sample size that we have, as there was a concern that the sample size, when we look at it by family size, are quite small, particularly for children up in Scotland. We think they are quite small, but we think we can still do this econometric analysis on it. But yeah, the 351 children in Scotland post the introduction of the Scottish Child Payment is very small and probably relates to about 100 families. So it is relatively small. Okay, so the next two slides are our results. So this one is with controls and this one is without control. No, sorry, this one is without controls and this one is with controls. This is our preferred specification, so I'm just going to talk about this one for now, but I can always go back to it. So in our pooled data, this is given by the top orange line, and on this, so the graph is a lot more easier to read, so I'll just talk to that. So when we look at the pooled data, so we include all children in regardless of their family size, then we find that there's no significant impact of living in Scotland post-Scottish Child Payment introduction. But when we look at it by family size, it suggests, or it speaks to those graphs that I showed before, where there is a significant negative decline in child poverty incidences after the introduction of the Scottish Child Payment for children who are in smaller families. However, we see either that it's insignificant and positive, or it's significant and positive for those in larger families as well. When we look at the broader poverty measures, however, we see that there is a negative impact, negative and significant impact for children, regardless of whether they live in a larger or smaller families. So that's for children living in material deprivation. It's lower after the introduction of the Scottish Child Payment, and they're living in Scotland. So in conclusion, we're still working on a number of different aspects of this project, but we think that the Scottish Child Payment is making a difference to families across the board, but particularly in terms of deeper poverty, so those who, for child material deprivation as well as for food insecure households. But for larger families, the Scottish Child Payment doesn't seem to be enough to push them across that poverty line. We don't really know why, and it's quite surprising about this positive coefficient, of these positive coefficients for children in larger families in Scotland, and why it's so different from the rest of the UK. We don't know whether this is because there's some unobserved or uncontrolled for factors, but it might also be due to the smaller sample sizes as well. So it means that we're going to be careful in interpreting what that will mean. Our next steps in the project, so we're quite early in this project, but our next steps are, so we want to explore further the rise in poverty rates in Scotland for larger families, And we also want to examine whether there's any cliff edges and work disincentives potentially created by Scottish child payment, and explore this with relation to family type as well. So, thank you very much.